a gente continua a nossa etapa que se iniciou ontem. Nós estamos naquela fase desse nosso evento de olhar o que tem acontecido no PDBFF e a gente tem realizado, então, esse conjunto de apresentações. Uma das apresentações de ontem, por causa do nosso problema técnico, né, ficou para hoje, a apresentação do William LAURANCE. Ele está falando direto da Austrália, e com um fuso horário, né, importante. Nós vamos começar com ele. E depois nós teremos uma sequência de apresentações. Mas nós vamos seguir aquela mesma jogada de ontem. Fazemos as apresentações e depois uma rodada de discussão. Porém, por causa do fuso horário, essa primeira apresentação do Bill, assim que ele acabar, nós vamos abrir para vocês aí um conjunto de 10, 15 minutos para vocês fazerem questões, perguntas a ele. E nas outras apresentações, a gente segue aquele modelo de ontem. Tudo bem? Podemos fazer assim, gente? Ainda todo mundo chegando. Peço agora, então, que vocês fiquem bastante atentos, porque a gente vai escutar, então, o professor William LAURANCE. Ele vai trazer uma conversa sobre uma floresta amazônica como laboratório para pesquisa sobre fragmentação e mudanças globais. Conversa muito do que a gente falou ontem, a fala do Beto, algumas outras falas. A gente está nesse crescente de construção do entendimento do PDB histórico para, a partir de quarta-feira, a gente começar a olhar o PDB que desejamos para os próximos 10, 15 anos. Então, eu convido aí o professor Bill. A palavra está com você, senhor. Bem-vindo.
Well, hello, everybody, and I'll say good morning because it's early morning here in Australia. It's great to be interacting with you all. I so much enjoyed the original conference presentations, at least the ones I could stay up for till about 3 o'clock in the morning here, the last couple of weeks. And anyway, obviously now what we're going to do is to re-tape the presentations to deal with the audio problems that happened before. And so we're ready to go ahead and start. So I will go ahead and share my screen here with you all, and we'll get started. So you can see the title, An Amazonian Forest as a Laboratory for Studying Global Change. I think that's one of the things that we would want to emphasize about the BDFFP is that it obviously started under Tom Lovejoy's original vision as sort of a study of biogeographic study of habitat fragmentation, but it has progressively expanded over time to include many other kinds of disciplines. Of course, and a huge amount of work that's going on, what might broadly be called global change research, other studies on forest regeneration, and just many aspects of forest ecology and basic functioning of Amazonian ecosystems, biogeography, lots of things. That's many insights that have come out from this project. So it really has turned into one of the world's great research projects, and there's been a lot of important results that have happened as a consequence. We all know that the Amazon has been disappearing at a pretty rapid rate. The rates were above 2 to 2.5 million hectares per year in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. They then dropped down a lot with improvements in satellite monitoring of illegal deforestation. But then under President Bolsonaro, they came back up again, not as high as they were before, but approaching 1 million hectares a year, which is a lot for any part of the world. Cattle ranching would be a very large driver, soy farming, and also things like industrial logging. All of this has contributed. And there really is ongoing in the Amazon a major push to expand the region's infrastructure. And some of this, of course, is justified and important, but some of the other projects really would not likely be approved were environmental considerations and also some social considerations probably given more importance. So that's a big driver of deforestation. This is a paper we published more than 20 years ago now, which looked at the Amazon basin under an upper scenario here, the so-called optimistic scenario, and a lower scenario, so-called non-optimistic scenario, and said, what would the Amazon look like essentially right now, 20 years into the future? And what you can see here, I think the biggest, most important conclusion was that, of course, there's a lot of forest loss and forest disruption and degradation, but really perhaps what's most striking is the amount of fragmentation of the Amazon on a very large spatial scale. So we're not just talking local landscapes, of a few 100,000 hectares, for instance, that would have forest fragments ranging from very small fragments on up to a few hundred hectares, something like that. We're talking here fragmentation on an absolutely massive scale across the basin. Those were the projections of that. Now, obviously, not all of that has come to pass, but some of it has. I'm not going to talk about this slide very much because I think just about everyone watching this presentation is going to know these basics about the BDFFP. It's obviously been going for a long time now. What are we talking, 44 years? There's not very many research projects in the world that have been going that long. And there's many advantages of the BDFFP. Now, the botanical research, a very quick overview. We've been working a lot with a network of 69 1-hectare plots arrayed across fragmented and intact forests. And you can see here the numbers of trees and lianas that have been censused as a result of this. There's also been a lot of work on secondary forests led by Rita Mesquita and Bruce Williamson. But this is quite separate to this work that I'm talking about. And also the Forest Geo 25-hectare plot, also separate to the work that I've been involved in. You can have a look here, and I think this slide just says it right here. This shows you the tree diversity in the Amazon compared to Barro, Colorado Island in Panama, and La Selva in Costa Rica, two of the world's most famous and iconic tropical areas. And I mean, here's their tree diversity, a number of stems greater than 10 centimeters in diameter of tree species per hectare. And you can see here the Amazon, well over 250 species on average. So it's truly a stunning ecosystem. And this work is being led, the BDFFP herbarium is being led by Anna Andrade. Susan Lawrence, my former wife, was also heavily involved in the project for some time. Actually, she still is. Okay, when we talked, if you have a conversation with someone who studies habitat fragmentation, which I've heard some people describe themselves as fragmentologists, what are the kinds of conversations you tend to hear often revolve around, what is causing the environmental changes that are happening in habitat fragments? Is it something associated with the size of the fragment, so that small fragments would presumably have much more severe effects than larger fragments? Is it related to the isolation and connectivity, so that a fragment that is, even though it's a fragment, it might still be connected by a secondary vegetation or by a small tongue of forest to a larger forest area. So it would be not necessarily completely isolated or unconnected. Edge effects, of course, are the physical and biophysical and biotic changes that are associated with the abrupt and artificial boundaries of habitat fragments. And finally, matrix effects are the characteristics of the modified vegetation. That could be cattle pastures, it could be second growth, it could be lots of things surrounding the habitat fragments. And how important are those things to fragments? Well, one of the things I'd like to convince you, and this is certainly not the case in all instances, but in many instances, it looks like edge effects seem to be really important, if not the primary driver of environmental change in these fragments. This is especially the case because these fragments have been studied from the period just before fragmentation on through the decades after fragmentation, and you do tend to see these edge effects being manifested, especially in the first decade or 2 or 3 decades after fragmentation. But you can see here how diverse the edge effects are. I mean, look at this. Every one of these things is some separate study that's been done on, leaf litter invertebrates, disturbance adapted trees, air temperature, species invasions. I mean, the list just goes on and on. And you can see here, so this would be our forest edge right here. And this would be the number of meters that these edge effects are concluded to penetrate into the forest, into the fragments. And you can see that some of them only penetrate a few meters and some of them penetrate hundreds of meters. So that is definitely an interesting result, and one that could potentially have quite far-reaching implications. Now, one of the most important of all of the edge effects is a big increase in tree mortality. It looks like to us, and I think there's probably some other things happening beyond what the two things I'm just going to mention. I think there's more nuanced things as well. But I think the two primary drivers of tree mortality in the BDFFP fragments are, one, microclimatic stresses that result from the creation of that forest edge. So you suddenly have much warmer conditions, much more variable temperatures, much higher light intensities, much more wind, all of that, much more desiccation stress. So a lot of that contributes to tree mortality. And we know this because we see right after the forest edge has been created, just in the first 2-3 months, trees will actually drop their leaves and just die standing, like this tree right here, for instance. There's nothing really structurally wrong with it. It's just lost its leaves and branches over time, but it's still there standing. So that's one thing. And the other thing, the other big cause is wind shear. This is quite apparent because we see a lot of trees that are snapped in half or uprooted and knocked over or otherwise damaged from wind. It's apparent that it's wind shear, and the wind can build up over the denuded landscapes surrounding the fragments and then slam into the forest edge and cause a lot of turbulence. And all that can lead to this big increase in tree mortality that we see in fragmented forests. Now, the matrix, we said that, remember the matrix, which is that vegetation around the fragments, this can be very important in terms of determining the intensity of edge effects, as it turns out. So for instance, if we look at tree mortality, and this is looking at mortality as a function of distances from the forest edge. So here's our edge right there. If you've got a pasture surrounding a fragment, you're getting quite a lot more tree mortality at every one of these edge distance categories. But if you've got some kind of regrowth around that, you're getting less tree mortality. And those are statistically significant differences. So that's an interesting result. And I think one that it fits our intuition, and it's an appealing result. It also has some interesting management implications. Now, the matrix, of course, the type of vegetation surrounding the fragments, also affects the seed rain. You get a lot of birds and bats flying back and forth between the fragments and the seed rain. And what they're then doing is transporting seeds back and forth between the two. And a lot of the seeds that are entering the fragments are typical of the plants that surround those fragments. So, for instance, if we look at Vismia-surrounded regrowth, we actually see a fairly diverse and somewhat even distribution of seeds coming from a lot of different species. If we look at Cecropia-surrounded regrowth, we see that there's a lot of Cecropia seeds and then mixed numbers of others, but not very many, not compared to the Cecropia. So that's really affecting the regeneration that's happening in the fragments, very likely. So we're getting tree fall gaps being created in fragments because of the high tree mortality. These seeds are coming in, many of them from the surrounding matrix. Many of these are sort of disturbance adapted or generalist species that can survive in a lot of conditions. And if they are establishing and then regenerating in the fragments, and I'll show you some evidence to indicate that they probably are, then that can have a very important impact on the future, the floristic future of the forest, because that is the beginning of setting the trajectory of change, long-term floristic change. So it's a very interesting result here. So if we look at these elevated rates of tree mortality, what we tend to see is that there's three big changes that tend to happen in the BDFFP fragments as a result of them. One is that there's changes in just the simple structure, the physical architecture of the forest. You can see here an area of fragmented forest that has a lot of canopy gaps. So for instance, if we look at the understory of a forest in an area where you've got an intact canopy overhead and a structurally intact forest, you're going to see it's going to be relatively open in the understory. It's still going to have high species diversity of a lot of understory plants and small trees, but you're also going to have some large trees that are really dominating things. And it's going to be relatively open and also really a buffered and stable microclimate. If you compared that with disturbed forests, you get this oftentimes just a profusion of exotic or disturbance adapted plant species that love that high light in the understory. And there's also various kinds of environmental changes that are associated with that. And we see these kinds of changes being reflected in the size distributions of trees. So for instance, I'm comparing here two sets of plots in our study area. One are forest edge plots, which are within 100 meters of the forest edge, and forest interior plots, which are more than 100 meters from the forest edge. Now, if we look at different size categories of trees here, small trees here on up to large trees here, really large trees here, what we see is the interior plots, and this is comparing the same plots over a period of about 20 years. Okay, and we're asking what changes are going on in each of those size categories of trees. In the interior plots, we see that a lot of these tree sizes they're pretty close to zero. There's not much change going on here, right? The trees in that size category aren't decreasing, they're not increasing, they're staying pretty stable. A little bit of an increase in larger trees, especially here, but overall, not a lot of change. We compare that with the edge plots, and we can see a big decline in trees in almost all the larger, virtually all the larger size classes, except for the smallest trees. And these are apparently seeing a big spike in recruitment due to the heavy damage in the forest, and that's creating, of course, tree fall gaps and opportunities for recruitment for these smaller trees. So that's one thing that we see, and it's really obvious in forests that have been fragmented for any period of time, is that there are structural differences in the forests and in the tree communities relative to unfragmented forests. Now, another big change are changes in species composition, and this is a lot more complicated given the very high number of species and the extreme rarity of many species in our study area. This is looking at every plot being compared to itself, so it's all 69 plots here, and you can see here that if we look in the forest interior, so again, here's our forest edge, and this is going further and further into the forest interior, and this is using a log axis, so that's about 3,000 meters there. So these are our most deep forest plots here, and you can see that if we compare them to themselves, we're getting a they're fairly similar. They're not changing very much, and they're not showing big changes in Euclidean distance, which is a measure of the dissimilarity of the plant community. But we look here on more of the edge plots, and we're seeing a lot more changes occurring. So, well, what's happening here? What's driving all this? Well, one of the things that's happening, of course, is a really big spike in the number of pioneer and early successional species that are proliferating in these different habitats. So you can see here, this again is looking at, this is looking at the density of 52 species of pioneers that are common in this BDFFP study area within 9 genera. And again, as you go closer and closer to the forest edge, you see this big increase in the pioneers. So that's a key thing that's causing these floristic changes. Another thing, of course, is that generally speaking, forests are sort of a zero-sum game. If there's going to be winners, there's got to be losers. And in fact, that's exactly what we see. We see a negative association between the abundance of the pioneer species and the abundances of old growth species. So when you're getting lots of pioneers, you're not getting very many of these old growth tree families. And these are important families in terms of these particular forests. So that's indicative. And also what we're seeing, and I think this is really intriguing, is a restructuring of old growth tree communities. Losers are often these smaller trees, and they tend to be the kinds of things that have obligate outbreeding, and they rely on animal seed dispersers. So that's an interesting result there. The subcanopy species, the smaller trees that tend to be affected, tend to be adapted for deep forest conditions. So they like high or relatively low light intensities. They like stable microclimates, that type of thing. So shade specialists. And they don't like edge conditions very well at all, according to our results. So that's very interesting. And the losses of animal seed dispersers and pollinators could obviously be important. And I would emphasize that when we're talking this, yes, we are talking some of the smaller trees in the forest, but many of them, of course, have important ecological relationships and evolutionary relationships with other species. And there are many of those species in the forest. Now, another completely different group of plants that's definitely changing in the fragments is our lianas. You can see here, this is actually looking at the abundances of lianas compared to the abundances of successional trees. And we know that those successional trees increase in fragments and near forest edges, and you can see that lianas do as well. And one of the things that we also have noticed is that in plots with lots of lianas, we don't have very much tree biomass. Now, why is that? Well, lianas and trees have an ancient and very deep antagonistic relationship with each other. And lianas, essentially, heavy liana infestations will suppress tree growth, they'll reduce tree reproduction, and they'll increase tree mortality. So all those things will reduce tree biomass. And that's important, of course, for things like carbon storage. So that leads us very naturally into our final category of environmental change that's happening in fragmented forests, and as a consequence of the high tree mortality and other changes, are altered carbon dynamics. When we look at the carbon storage and carbon dynamics of fragmented forests in the Amazon, we see that they're really quite disrupted relative to intact forests. We see a substantial drop in tree biomass, live tree biomass, and the trees are overwhelmingly the most important components of biomass in these forests. So a substantial decline in tree biomass over time near forest edges. Well, obviously part of that is, or at least a contributing factor, is the high rates of tree mortality that we're getting in fragmented forests generally. But even so, even beyond that, not only are a lot of trees dying in fragments, but the biggest trees turn out to be the most vulnerable. Here we see the relative mortality increase in the fragments relative to intact forest, and look in the different size categories, and look at that, at the trees, the really big trees in the forest, the canopy and emergent species. What's happening there? Well, we're not really sure. One thing is, we know that these big, tall trees probably really struggle with hydraulic pressures. They're trying to bring water up from the ground, from the soil, all the way up into their canopy foliage. And that vegetation can be 50, 60 meters tall in emergent trees, even taller in some cases. Certainly, well, in Southeast Asia, it can be 80 to 100 meters tall. Another thing is that the big trees, as they get bigger, at first when trees are growing, they just try to grow up and get taller and taller. Then they start getting thicker and thicker as they get bigger. And those thick trees are not as flexible as younger or smaller trees. And so they become very stiff and very thick, and therefore probably more vulnerable to wind shear, probably less able to resist it. Now, there's other things that could contribute as well. Liana infestations, we know, tend to be heavier in older trees. Older trees are often larger trees, so that might be a possibility. The big trees might actually be functioning as lightning rods. That's an interesting idea, but work by Bill Magnuson at INPA has shown that lightning is a surprisingly important cause of tree mortality in the central Amazon. And another thing that contributes to this decline of carbon and decline of biomass in forests is that the species that are replacing the big trees after they die, which are things like, Cecropia and other pioneer species, and also lianas, these tend to have low wood density, and low wood density translates into low carbon storage. So the bottom line is we're changing these forests in a lot of ways all at once, and it is definitely reducing overall the carbon storage, at least over the time scales that we're looking at, which has been in the first few decades after fragmentation. And there are other things that happen. Of course, we're getting a lot of trees that are being killed in the fragments, a lot of branches and tree crowns being snapped off, that type of thing. And so there's a big accumulation of coarse wood debris and fine wood debris in the forest understory. You can see here the annual estimated production of coarse wood debris, and it definitely is increasing near forest edges because we're getting a lot more tree damage and mortality. So that's an interesting and important thing, and that could have ecological implications too for all kinds of species. Excuse me. And then another thing, an important one, environmental change, and this is not something we see in the BDFFP study area because fires are largely controlled and other things. But if we look at places in so-called typical fragmented landscapes in the Amazon, we would oftentimes see some dynamics that look like this, which is a big increase in fire frequency near forest edges. And looking here in the forest interior, we get very few fires, and then getting closer and closer within 1,000 or 2,000 meters of the edges, we're seeing a big spike in fire and frequency. And that's occurring because most of the fragments, or many of the fragments, are surrounded by cattle pastures, and cattle ranchers like to burn their pastures every year in order to produce a flush of green grass and to control the weeds, all of which the cattle like. And yeah, so that's an important thing. And then also there's forest disturbance. There's breaks in the forest canopy. There's lots of woody debris in the understory, which tends to dry out because there's so many canopy gaps. So all of those things militate towards an ecosystem that is becoming or has become much more fire prone than it would have been if it were intact. Now, that's not the only thing that happens in the BDFFP. I've been emphasizing there the fragmentation work. Wanted to just touch on very briefly a couple of studies that we've done that have looked more at global change phenomena. I'm convinced, and I think many people are convinced, that there are important global change events happening in the BDFFP study area. This is a study here that we published in Nature, which showed 2004, which showed that tree communities appear to be changing in quite concerted ways over time. In other words, there's a lot of similarity among different plots, and there's sort of a seeming trajectory of change that's occurring within the plots in intact forests. The smaller species, again, are declining, small species of trees, while larger canopy species are are increasing. And these results are broadly consistent, and there's not really time to discuss them now, but they're broadly consistent with some global change drivers, particularly rising levels of atmospheric CO2, which could cause, probably cause plant fertilization in forest systems and may then lead to different kinds of changes in species composition. So that's one thing that's happening. Another thing that's happening is that the lianas are increasing, not just in the fragments where we would expect them to occur, because the lianas love forest disturbance, but they're also increasing in intact forests that are not disturbed. Again, this result seems consistent with what we'd expect from rising CO2 levels. And what appears to be happening in the BDFFP fragment is that you're getting a double whammy. You're getting the lianas increasing due to edge effects and increased disturbance in the fragments. And you're evidently also getting lianas increasing because of global change phenomena or some kind of large-scale driver, which we think might be related to rising levels of CO2. So a very interesting 1-2 punch of synergism happening in the Amazon. Now, there's quite a lot of other work that's going on at the BDFFP using the more recent censuses. Our work is largely finished, I think around the mid-2000s, or sorry, it would have been about 2010, I guess, that we sort of stopped looking at the data, although we've continued looking at it in certain ways. So anyway, you can just have a quick look here and see some of the different kinds of studies that are ongoing. A lot of Brazilian researchers here, a lot of work that's a lot of students, a lot of work that's focused on more specific kinds of things, not necessarily fragmentation effects, might be, for instance, demography of Lacithidaceae. The forest plots collaborations under Oliver Phillips in the UK and Yadvinder Male at Oxford are looking at using our data sets and looking at various kinds of global change phenomena. We're looking at lianas, and I've been looking at lianas and fragmentation in my team. And also Susan Lawrence is leading some work that's using data that we collected a long time ago on small trees. And we're currently looking at those data also. But anyway, that gives you a sense of the diversity of different uses of the BDFFP data set. It's very gratifying to me to see the diversity of different number of Brazilian and other Latin American and other researchers that are involved in this work. And with that, I will thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today, and look forward to speaking to you all at another time. Bye-bye.
Tá aberto aí, gente. Quem quiser alguma questão?
To see if the patterns are still holding, and so if those effects are permanent, or is there any evidence of temporality, and also when the most dramatic changes occur. It's right at the beginning, the first few years, 5 years, 10 years, or, So that's my question to you.
Okay, well, that was from Geraldo Vasconcelos. Good question. So in terms of the dynamics of what's happening, I would say the first few years are definitely the most important. You see dramatic changes, the first 5 years or so. And they continue on probably for at least a couple decades, and then you get a gradual change. And so Geraldo's question was, are there other things that are happening? And you do see, and is there a partial recovery? And we are seeing a partial recovery, particularly in forest biomass. It appears that you do get this pulse of mortality, and then there may be a recovery. There's still substantial changes in floristic composition. Those are going to take much longer periods to be overcome. But it does seem like the fragments, at least the BDFFP fragments, which one has to emphasize, have not been logged, like most fragments everywhere else, have not been burned, like quite a few fragments everywhere else. They've not been overhunted, like lots of fragments everywhere else. So we're dealing in a special situation here, and we've got to keep that in mind when we talk about the management implications and the conservation implications of our research. Anyway, thanks.
Eu sou Eni, estou chefe da área PDBFF, né? E a minha pergunta é relacionada às mudanças climáticas. A gente tende a dar uma ênfase maior nas secas, né? No período seco, longos, né? mas eu vejo assim que a precipitação, assim, períodos de longa precipitação, como a gente tem vivido agora, eu vejo assim que são importantes também. Eu queria saber do senhor como é que o senhor observa a mudança na mortalidade de árvores em períodos com muita chuva. Se existe algum efeito quando você tem uma seca extrema e eventos de muito tempo de alta precipitação, como é que a floresta tem respondido a essa mudança?
That's an interesting question. So, how much does high rainfall affect tree mortality in places like the BDFFP? When you get really intense rain, of course, which you can get at times, you tend to get a lot of waterlogging, especially in lower lying parts of the landscape. Now, the BDFFP, is relatively flat, but there's still quite a lot of inundation. Anyway, the rolling topography and stream cuts and other types of things. So there are lower parts of the landscape, and those can flood. And sometimes they can be quite large. They can be several thousand square meters or even larger than that. And that'll cause a lot of tree mortality due to waterlogging. So you're absolutely right. People are talking a lot about droughts now, of course, and for good reasons. Droughts are really important. But I think that the rainfall trends and all that are important because they can affect the forest. They'll affect the forest composition, biomass functioning, a lot of things. But I think the tree mortality would be patchy and associated with locally low-lying areas. That would be where you'd see the big changes. And by the way, there's been some publications on that. Yeah.
Did the situation envisaged in the 2000 papers actually occur in full or in part? What part? By the way, I believe this is an excellent proposal for the future of the BDFFP.
I guess what Thiago is asking is if the patterns that you analyze by the year 2000, more or less, most of your papers are based at that time, it still holds by the last census, like 2020, so 43 years now since the initial census. That's the question. That was my question, more or less.
Did the situation...
Okay, there's two questions there, and they're a little bit different. The first part that I heard was asking about at least this is what I understood, was asking about the projections that we made about the Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon, and whether or not those projections made more than 20 years ago are holding today. And the answer is, or have held today. And the answer is partially. So there's certainly been, a number of the projects and other things that we projected, they've gone in. One good example would be the BR-163 highway, which goes from Santarém all the way south down to Mato Grosso. That's caused incredible forest destruction. I mean, it was actually seen by, I think they said it would be visible from the moon because there was this long fire of like 1,000 kilometers of fire, which you could see at night along this road. Then there's been other roads like the BR-319, which of course goes from Manaus south and right through to I think also to Mato Grosso. And the BR-319 is being constructed. It's still under construction, and it is having also lots of environmental changes associated with it. So the short answer is there's a partial agreement, and the agreements really are evident in places where projects have gone ahead. The things that we said would happen if the projects proceed have happened pretty much when those projects have proceeded. Not always. There's lots of complications and changes. And then Geraldo was asking, I think, what I thought was more about our fragmentation studies on tree communities and lianas and other things, and whether or not the early results hold. And the answer is not really. Yes and no. Some things are sort of long-term changes that are occurring over time, I think, long-term trajectories. Other things, you get big pulses, episodic events. like what's happening probably with some of the edge effects. You're also getting periodic disturbance events such as windstorms. You get droughts. I mean, what we're seeing is a complicated, almost conspiracy of environmental changes and other kinds of environmental variations that collectively can have important impacts on forests. And why this is so important is this. What it's telling us is we need to keep studying the BDFFP because it's so unique and because it's providing us with so many important insights into how fragmented ecosystems are going to behave or are behaving, not just under the regime of land use change, but also under the regime of global change and all the atmospheric and other kinds of changes that can be happening associated with that. So I think hopefully that in a very general way answers those two questions.
Hey, Bill, Beto here. I have a more pragmatical question. You, in your talk, really good talk, thank you. But you show a lot of results that show age effects in the fragments. And one thing that BDFFP has been doing in the past year has been re-isolating the fragments because the fragmentation, there's a regrowth. I would like to, for you to say, what is your opinion about re-isolation? Should this continue? What is your view on that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really important question, Beto. I think my personal view would be that I think the re-isolation should continue at least until there's been time for a very comprehensive scientific review to the BDFP. I mean, I know that's happening right now, but I think that there's so much so much of the identity of the fragmentation project revolves around fragmentation, and if you change that, you could turn it into some much more nuanced look at landscape dynamics, all types of things. But I think those things, a lot of that stuff is happening anyway. There's a lot of that research going on, but you need that important, common, coherent theme that brings everything together. And maintaining the fragment isolation is an important part of that. There's a lot of things that we could discuss about the details of this. You know, is 100 meters a big enough type of re-isolation and all that? But unless and until we have a specific reason to change the status quo, I would probably stick with it. That would be my suggestion. One possibility would be in future, you know, we might decide that a component, or the team in Manaus might decide that a component of the fragments, part of them, should be allowed to have a matrix completely regenerate and see how they change. And then you'd be doing an explicit comparison, an experimental comparison between fragments of one kind of matrix versus another kind of matrix. That'd all be tremendously interesting. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done, but you know, we've got this one big landscape or set of landscapes. And yeah, I would maintain the isolation, at least for now.
David G. Luther, he said he's curious what you think of the relative influence of extreme weather events, such as weak or intense heat, compared to prolonged dry seasons on tree communities here in the Amazon?
Yeah, that's also quite a perceptive question. I think these short, intense events can be very important. And I think a lot of ecologists think that. So we're talking intense heat, sometimes intense dry weather conditions. We're talking about ecosystems where if forests have been fragmented, you know, they're much more prone to desiccation then. And so these kinds of things can have an even greater effect. Gradual changes in you know, the thermometer over time can of course be very important too. But I think these are more incremental changes, and they're, you know, probably the things I would be looking at being a really important driver in terms of incremental change would be carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. CO2 levels, I think, are a very important thing. And there may well be, with temperature and other environmental variables, threshold effects. So you get to a certain point and suddenly, you know, you just had too much dry weather or too much warm weather. Yeah, that's actually something that's been seen here in Australia, for instance, where warming conditions, it turns out that the flying foxes, which everybody can see, they're obvious, they roost in these big colonies, great big giant, you know, meter bats with meter wingspans. When the thermometer hits about 41 degrees centigrade, they start dying, and they die in their thousands. We've had literally tens of thousands of these bats killed by heat waves. Very much a threshold effect. They're surviving at 41 and a half degrees. They're really in a lot of trouble. So I think those gradual changes can be important, but right now it really does look like these intense, severe events really are probably one of the most critical drivers we need to be concerned with.
And one last question, Ricardo Rocha. He said he has a question that is not really related to your talk, but he's wondering if you have any insight on how we can increase intergenerational crossover between PDBFF researchers, and how can we build upon the experience of young and senior members?
Oh, that's so good. Well, look, a conference, I think face-to-face, this is good and it's always helpful, but and so they're doing that. But I would think one thing we could have a big symposium at a major scientific conference, Ecological Society of Brazil or ATBC or one of the conservation biology, one of these conferences. We could have a big BDFFP symposium at that, and you could bring a lot of people together. I think getting people together around the table, so you're getting the old gray researchers that have been there for quite a long time, and then you've got the young group. Ideally, what we would do is if you did something like that, if you didn't do it in Manaus, there might be advantages of doing it in Manaus, because then students and everybody else could get there cheaply. It wouldn't cost them anything or not much. If you did it overseas, of course, you might need to provide some travel funds for the students. But I think that kind of thing. Look, there's nothing that's better than face-to-face interaction and communication for just trying to build those kinds of bonds. They foster collaborations. They foster a lot of really good interactions. They foster an enormous amount of exchange of information and understanding. So I think that's such an important thing. I really hope that's, this event right here, big credit to Beto and Anna and others for bringing this event off. But also something like what you described there, Ricardo, I think would be great in the future.
Professor, nós agradecemos muito seu tempo, sua contribuição. Então, uma salva de palmas, pessoal, por favor.
Obrigado, meu prazer.